Hey guys, tonight we step into streets that seem to rise faster than your sleepy brain wants to accept. You stand beneath rows of stone front buildings, cornices stacked like wedding cakes, windows repeating into the mist, and towers lifting over avenues that smell faintly of coal smoke, wet brick, horse leather, and fresh-cut timber. The story of Tartarian construction sits in a strange place. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm what-if imagination. Most historians agree that 19th century cities could grow with astonishing speed, especially when railroads, factories, quarries, immigrant labour and industrial ambition all pulled in the same direction. At the same time, some old photographs and timelines might make you pause. Historians debate how much those images reveal, how much they hide, and how much our modern eyes misunderstand. And you probably won't survive this, at least not emotionally, if someone asks you to lay brick for 12 hours without iced coffee. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your little corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are walking now, slowly, along a broad 19th century street where the morning fog has not fully lifted. Your boots press into mud that has been beaten flat by wagons, horses, boots, carts, and 1,000 impatient errands. The city around you is young, but it does not look young. That is the first little puzzle. The buildings seem to wear old faces. They have columns, arches, domes, pediments, iron balconies, carved lintels, and heavy doors that look as though they should open into some ancient empire rather than a city still arguing about sewer lines and street lamps. Most historians agree that this visual contradiction has a practical explanation. Many American and European cities in the 19th century borrowed architectural languages from Greece, Rome, Renaissance Europe, and Baroque capitals. Architects were trained to believe that classical forms represented order, dignity, learning, wealth, and power. If a bank wanted to look trustworthy, it borrowed a temple front. If a courthouse wanted to look eternal, it wore columns like a judge wears robes. If a hotel wanted to impress guests who had just stepped down from a train with sore backs and questionable luggage, it added a grand cornice and pretended nobody inside was arguing with a chamber pot. So the strange oldness of these new cities is documented, but the feeling it creates is more slippery. You look at a photograph from the 1870s or 1880s, and a question begins to hover. How did all this appear so quickly? How did streets that had been rough, wooden, smoky, and unfinished become lined with buildings that seem almost too confident? One interpretation is that the speed itself became part of the myth. When construction happens across decades, city by city, contract by contract, brick by brick, it is understandable. But when you see the result compressed into a handful of old photographs, the human mind does a little trick. It removes the sweat. It forgets the scaffolding. It erases the workers. Suddenly, the city looks as though it simply arrived. That is where the Tartarian construction theory begins to breathe in the background. To be clear, this is debated. A fringe idea proposes that many grand 19th century buildings were not built by the societies that claimed them, but inherited from an earlier civilization, sometimes called Tartaria. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has become popular online because it speaks to a real emotional reaction. The sense that some old buildings feel too large, too ornate, too quickly built, and too casually demolished. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less of a claim and more of a question about memory. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not necessarily a vanished empire, but a lost relationship with labour, beauty, time, and scale. The evidence we do have points to a powerful engine of ordinary causes. Bricks were made in staggering quantities. Railroads moved lumber, stone, iron, glass, and workers across long distances. Steam-powered machinery made some tasks faster. Pattern books allowed builders to copy fashionable designs. Cast iron could be manufactured and shipped in pieces. Brick factories could produce standardized units by the millions. Skilled masons, carpenters, plasterers, metalworkers and quarrymen moved from site to site as cities expanded. In some places, building was almost contagious. One new commercial block encouraged another. A new station pulled hotels around it. A new courthouse raised land values nearby. A new avenue became a stage where everyone wanted a better costume. You pause beside a half-finished structure. The wooden scaffolding creaks softly above you. Men stand on planks, tapping bricks into place with quick practice motions. Mortar slides from a trowel with a wet scrape. Someone shouts for more lime. A wagon wheel sinks into mud with the tired sound of history being inconvenient. Here, the impossible begins to look a little more possible. Not easy, not magical, just brutally coordinated. The city is not being conjured, it is being assembled by people whose backs ache before lunch. And yet, the mystery does not fully disappear. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can document materials, contracts, companies, architects, fire insurance maps, newspaper announcements, and city directories. We can trace many buildings to real designers and real owners, but old records are uneven. Some burned. Some were never kept carefully. Some buildings were altered so many times that their original story becomes a layered sandwich of brick, rumour, permits, and someone probably knew, but unfortunately, that someone is very dead. Historians still argue whether the speed of 19th century urban growth should be understood mostly as an industrial achievement, a financial gamble, a labour story, or a cultural performance wearing stone and plaster. You keep walking and the street widens. Overhead, telegraph wires cross like dark threads against a pale sky. A horse snorts steam from its nostrils. A boy carries newspapers under one arm, calling headlines that vanish into the clatter. The smell of fresh lumber mixes with coal smoke and damp wool. The city is alive but not polished. It is noisy, dirty, unfinished, ambitious, and slightly ridiculous, like someone wearing a tuxedo while standing ankle-deep in mud. That may be the best way to understand these so-called impossible cities. They were grand and messy at the same time. A careful reading might suggest that the Tartarian fascination is not only about buildings, it is also about disbelief. Modern construction often looks flat, quick, efficient, and temporary. Many people look at old train stations, courthouses, libraries, theatres and hotels and wonder why ordinary public buildings once looked like palaces. A more cautious explanation could be that economics, labour costs, materials, building codes, taste and public ambition have changed. Ornamental plaster and carved stone were once more common in public architecture because they communicated civic pride. Today, the same budget might disappear into mechanical systems, elevators, fire safety, seismic requirements, parking structures, and a conference room with chairs no human spine requested. Still, as you stand beneath a cornice that catches the weak morning light, you understand why rumours grow. A popular rumour claims that some buildings seem to appear in records only after they were already standing. Sometimes that rumour comes from missing documents, sometimes from misunderstood dates, sometimes from buildings photographed after completion but discussed online without context. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It might support the idea that people are asking good questions, but not necessarily that the most dramatic answers are correct. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that 19th century construction could be breathtakingly fast when money, labour, materials, and urgency aligned. The interpretation is that later viewers, seeing only the finished beauty, may underestimate the machinery of growth behind it. The imagination is softer. What if these streets remember the rhythm of a vanished workday, not a vanished empire? What if every brick still holds the tap of a trowel, every arch keeps the echo of a shouted instruction, every tower preserves the ambitions of people who wanted their new cities to look ancient from the moment they opened their doors? You move past another row of buildings. Some are finished, some are half dressed in scaffolding, some are empty lots waiting for foundations. The impossible speed becomes less like lightning and more like weather, steady, relentless, made of countless small forces. And yet in the mist, when the repeating windows fade into grey and the street lamps look like little moons, the city still feels as though it arrived from somewhere else. You know the safe explanation. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, but you also allow the mist to remain. Because tonight we're not proving anything, we're following clues. You keep moving through the damp city morning, and the little sound that follows you is not mystical at first. It is metal on metal. A rail joint clicks somewhere beyond the warehouses. A switchman calls out. A locomotive exhales in a long, sleepy sigh, the kind of sigh that seems too tired to belong to a machine and too smoky to belong to a living thing. The city's speed begins there, not in a hidden chamber or a vanished crown, but in the ordinary miracle of transportation. Most historians agree that railroads transformed 19th century construction by shrinking distance. Stone could leave a quarry at dawn, timber could roll in from forests far away, iron beams could arrive from foundries, and bricks could travel in numbers that would make any tired wagon horse file a formal complaint. You stand beside a freight platform where men unload crates, barrels, boards, and metal fittings. Everything smells of coal soot, wet rope, pine resin, hot grease, and muddy wool. The rails glitter under a thin skin of moisture. This is not glamorous. Nobody here looks like they are secretly managing an ancient energy grid. One man is chewing something with the grim focus of a person who has accepted breakfast as a personal insult. Another is balancing a plank on his shoulder while pretending his spine is not negotiating resignation. And yet, taken together, this scene is one of the great explanations for what later viewers call impossible scale. The evidence we do have points to a world where materials move faster than ever before. In older periods, construction depended heavily on what could be found nearby or carried slowly by river, cart, or coastal shipping. By the 19th century, rail networks allowed cities to pull resources from broad regions. A courthouse in one town might use stone from another state. A station might receive iron parts from a distant industrial centre. A hotel might be framed with lumber cut hundreds of miles away. Add canals, steamships, riverboats, and expanding road systems, and suddenly the city is no longer limited to its immediate landscape. It becomes a mouth, endlessly eating timber, brick, glass, lime, iron, labour, and money. One interpretation is that this networked appetite is what makes the buildings look mysterious now. When you see the finished facade, you do not see the supply chain. You do not see the quarrymen cutting stone in cold air, the brickmakers stacking clay into kilns, the carpenters shaping joists, the foundry workers pouring iron, the clerks writing invoices, the railroad crews repairing track, the cooks feeding labourers, the laundresses washing clothes blackened by soot, and the engineers making sure bridges do not become dramatic lessons in gravity. You see a building and the mind says, all at once. History says, no, very much not all at once. More like 1,000 errands wearing a fancy hat. Still, there is room for wonder. A careful reading might suggest that some construction timelines feel compressed because publicity loved speed. Newspapers celebrated rapid progress. City boosters wanted investors to believe that growth was unstoppable. Real estate promoters described new neighbourhoods as if they had sprung fully formed from ambition itself. A building that took years of planning, financing, grading, material preparation, and permitting might be remembered only by the short period when walls visibly rose. To the eye, that is construction. To the record, the work began earlier in contracts, surveys, and quiet decisions. Historians still argue whether 19th century boomtown narratives exaggerated speed as civic theatre, or simply reflected how dramatically industrial systems changed daily life. You turn into a brickyard at the edge of town, where the ground itself seems to have been persuaded to become architecture. Rows of bricks sit drying in the open air, thousands upon thousands of small red rectangles waiting for walls. The smell is earthy, mineral, warm, and slightly sour from wet clay. Men and boys move between stacks. Kilns smoke in the distance. A horse-drawn cart creaks by under a load that looks heavy enough to make the horse question the entire concept of civilization. Archaeology suggests that brickmaking has ancient roots, of course, but the 19th century brought increasingly mechanized production in many industrial regions. Machines could mix, press, extrude, cut or shape clay faster than hand methods alone. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not without human labor, but enough to matter. Standardization changed the rhythm of building. Bricks became units in a larger industrial song. 1 brick is humble. 10 bricks are a nuisance. 10 million bricks begin to look like a city, deciding it has plans for the evening. And this is where the Tartarian rumour begins to lean over the fence. A fringe idea proposes that such massive brick and stone cities were too extensive to be explained by known 19th century labour. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it often points to old photographs of elaborate buildings standing in places that look muddy, sparse, or newly settled. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes, why does the contrast feel so sharp? Why does a grand opera house beside a dirt street seem stranger than the same opera house surrounded by pavement, cars and traffic lights? A more cautious explanation could be that infrastructure does not always arrive in the order we expect. A town might build an impressive bank before paving every road. A county might erect a courthouse before proper sidewalks. A railroad station might appear before surrounding neighbourhoods mature. Wealthy investors could construct symbolic buildings in raw places because those buildings helped create value. They were not just responses to growth, they were advertisements for growth. The facade said, "Trust us, this place has a future," even if the street outside currently says, "Please bring boots." You step inside a partly finished warehouse and the sound changes. Outside, the city rattles and hisses. Inside, every hammer blow is magnified. Wooden beams smell sharp and clean. Mortar dust floats in the light. A pulley squeaks overhead, lifting a load with slow, stubborn dignity. The walls are plain, functional, and strong. This is the backstage version of grandeur. Not every building is a palace. Most construction is storage, housing, factories, workshops, stables, sheds, walls, drains, and foundations. The surviving photographs often favour the impressive buildings because people photograph what they are proud of. Nobody usually says, "Gather around children, we are taking a portrait of the municipal drainage trench," though honestly, on this channel, you and I might watch that for 2 hours and call it cosy. What's broadly accepted is that industrial cities grew through overlapping systems of labour and capital. Immigrant communities provided enormous amounts of skilled and unskilled labour. Many workers endured long hours, dangerous conditions, unstable wages, and crowded housing. Skilled trades mattered deeply. A mason's hand, a plasterer's eye, a carpenter's measured cut, an engineer's calculation, and a foreman's schedule could decide whether a building stood proudly or became a cautionary tale with dust. The human cost was real, even when records reduce it to numbers. If the evidence is thin about one individual worker, we'll say so. But the larger pattern is clear enough. The city was made by many hands, not one mysterious hand hidden behind a curtain. The what-if remains, but it softens. What if the real lost civilization is not Tartaria as a literal empire, but a lost civilization of coordination? A world where material networks, cheap labour by modern standards, public ambition, and ornamental skill briefly aligned so intensely that later generations struggled to believe it. That's a possibility, not a certainty. It is an interpretation, not a verdict. But it has a quiet power. You listen to the rails clicking again in the distance, and it feels almost like a heartbeat under the street. The bricks you saw earlier, the damp wall smell, the trowel scrape from the first street, all of it returns as a pattern. The city is not rising from nowhere. It is being fed. It is being scheduled. It is being hauled, cut, fired, mortared, financed, praised, delayed, repaired, and occasionally cursed by someone who dropped a tool from scaffolding and learned that gravity is very committed to its job. The impossible speed begins to look like a giant machine made from smaller machines and smaller hands and smaller choices all moving at once. And as evening lowers itself over the rail yard, every hammer strike seems to land in time with the locomotive's breath. You are not looking at magic exactly. You are looking at industry behaving so completely that, from a distance, it almost resembles magic. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Most of the ground here is iron, brick, smoke and labour. But the mist is still there, curling beneath the station lamps, asking one more quiet question. If a city can be assembled this quickly by ordinary means, why does ordinary suddenly feel so strange? You follow the breath of the locomotive until it becomes the hush of a different kind of machine, one built not only from iron and steam, but from spectacle. The city opens into a fairground. Ahead of you, pale towers rise in the moonlight, domes shimmer above lagoons, colonnades stretch like the ribs of some enormous sleeping animal, and white facades glow as if they have borrowed a little light from the clouds. It is almost too beautiful to trust. That, of course, is how World's Fairs like to introduce themselves. They were not shy. They were grand announcements wearing plaster, paint, electric bulbs, flags, fountains, and enough confidence to make a marble statue look underdressed. Most historians agree that World's Fairs and international expositions were among the greatest public spectacles of the 19th and early 20th centuries. They displayed industry, empire, invention, art, machinery, architecture, colonial fantasies, national pride, and commercial ambition all in one place. They were designed to overwhelm. Cities used them to advertise progress. Nations used them to stage identity. Companies used them to show new technologies. Visitors used them to walk until their feet quietly filed for divorce. The scale was huge, but the purpose was clear. Build a temporary dream so convincing that people would remember it as destiny. The evidence we do have points to practical methods behind the dream. Many exposition buildings were not built like permanent stone palaces, even when they looked like them. They often used wood frames, staff, plaster, hemp fibre, metal lath, painted surfaces, and other temporary or semi-temporary materials. Staff, a mixture commonly associated with fair architecture, could be moulded into classical ornament and painted to resemble stone. From a distance, especially under sunlight or electric illumination, it could look monumental. Up close, it was still theatre. Very beautiful theatre, yes, but theatre all the same. Architecture had put on costume jewellery and somehow made everyone applaud. You stand at the edge of a lagoon and watch the reflection of a palace ripple in the dark water. The dome above it looks ancient. The walls suggest Rome, Venice, Paris, and a dozen imagined capitals at once. A careful reading might suggest that this is one reason Tartarian construction theories often circle around fairgrounds. The buildings look impossibly grand. The photographs look haunting. And the idea that so much beauty could be built quickly, then demolished, feels almost offensive to modern viewers. Why would anyone create a dream city and then tear it down? It sounds like baking a wedding cake, admiring it for 5 minutes, and then using it to patch a pothole. But a more cautious explanation could be that impermanence was part of the plan. Many fair buildings were intended as temporary exhibition halls, not eternal monuments. They had to impress quickly, serve crowds, house displays, and then vanish or be replaced. Some structures did survive longer. Some were rebuilt in permanent materials. Some burned, decayed, or were demolished when maintenance costs became too high. What looks like a lost city might sometimes be a stage set designed for a season of wonder. This does not make it less moving. In a way, it makes it more ghostly. Historians still argue whether World's Fairs should be remembered mostly as celebrations of progress, displays of imperial power, laboratories of urban design, or carefully managed illusions. Each view has weight. The fairs brought new technologies to public attention, including electric lighting, transportation systems, communication devices, and consumer products. They also displayed people and cultures through frameworks that modern readers often recognize as biased, unequal, and shaped by empire. The beauty was real, the politics were real, the showmanship was real, the unease was real too. You walk beneath an arcade where lamps glow in soft rows. and the air smells of damp plaster, varnish, machine oil, flowers, cigar smoke, and the sweet fried scent of fair food drifting from a nearby stand. Somewhere a band plays a slow tune. Somewhere a crowd laughs at a demonstration of a device that promises to improve the future, or at least make a salesman slightly richer by Thursday. You pass a pavilion filled with machinery, gears turning, belts sliding, flywheels spinning. This is the documented world of industrial exhibition, where progress performs for an audience. And yet the moonlight changes everything. By day, the fair is noisy, crowded, commercial, and full of sore ankles. By night, it becomes a vision. Towers float, water doubles the buildings, electric lamps soften cheap materials into enchantment. This is where imagination enters gently. What if the glow outlived the buildings? Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally. What if people remembered these temporary cities so intensely that, generations later, photographs still seem to hum? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm about feeling. How did a place built partly from temporary materials become so permanent in the public imagination? A fringe idea proposes that some exposition grounds were not temporary at all, but remnants of older Tartarian cities disguised as fair architecture. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the documented records for many fairs include planners, architects, contractors, construction photographs, budgets, schedules, and descriptions of temporary materials. If the evidence is thin for a fringe claim, we'll say so. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the attraction of the idea becomes understandable. People see monumental buildings, then read that they were made quickly and destroyed soon after, and something in the mind resists. Surely, it whispers, surely there must be more. One interpretation is that the more is not necessarily a hidden empire, but a hidden discomfort with waste and impermanence. Modern viewers look at fair palaces and think, we would never build like that just to remove it. But societies do create temporary grandeur. They build Olympic venues, festival grounds, movie sets, temporary cathedrals of commerce, and elaborate displays that vanish after the event. Humans have always made things for ritual moments. A fair was a ritual of progress. It said, look how far we have come. Look where we might go next. Please ignore the mud behind the pavilion, the budget problems, and the workers trying to repair a cracked cornice before breakfast. You pause near a facade where a carved-looking figure stands above an entrance. Up close, the surface is not stone. It is moulded, painted, and already weathering at the edges. Rain has touched it. Dust has settled in its details. It is beautiful, but not immortal. This might support the idea that old photographs can mislead the eye. Black and white images flatten material differences. Plaster can resemble marble. Painted wood can resemble carved stone. A temporary wall can look eternal when the camera cannot show its fragility. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it helps explain why the fair palaces feel so strange in old images. The fairground begins to quiet. Workers sweep walkways. A guard passes with a lantern. The lagoon reflects a dome that will one day be gone, and you feel the small sadness of temporary beauty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that exposition architecture often combines speed, temporary materials, huge crews, and theatrical design. The interpretation is that later viewers may mistake theatrical permanence for structural permanence. The imagined part is softer. What if the fair was a dream the industrial age had about itself, so convincing that even now, when you see its towers in photographs, you feel like you have discovered a city that should still be there. You walk on, and the sound of your boots crosses from plank to gravel to damp earth. Behind you, the palaces remain luminous for a while, floating above their reflections. Ahead, the streets darken again. A brick smell returns. A rail clicks faintly. The same motif follows you: smoke, mud, light, and the feeling that ordinary history, when scaled large enough, becomes almost impossible to distinguish from myth. The glowing fairground fades behind you, and the path carries you back into a city that feels lower, heavier and wetter. The moonlight is gone now, swallowed by a grey afternoon sky that presses down on roofs, chimneys and telegraph wires. Rain has been falling long enough to turn unpaved streets into a dark, shining paste. Wagon wheels cut grooves through it. Horses step carefully, as if the city itself has become a suspicious desert. You move along the edge of the sidewalk, listening to the soft slap of mud against boots, and ahead, half hidden beneath a raised street, a row of windows peers out from below ground level. This is where one of the strangest Tartarian-adjacent questions begins. Why do so many old buildings seem to have buried doors, sunken windows, and lower floors that look as if the earth rose around them? What's broadly accepted is that many cities changed their street grades over time. Roads were raised, sidewalks were rebuilt, drainage systems were improved, basements were converted, and older entrances were partly buried by later construction. In some places, entire streets were lifted to reduce flooding or improve sanitation. In others, foundations settled, surrounding ground levels changed, or later pavement covered earlier thresholds. Not glamorous perhaps, but very human. If you have ever watched a road crew spend 6 months making one intersection worse before making it better, you understand the ancient spirit of public works. The documented story often begins with water. Cities built near rivers, lakes, marshes, coastlines, or low ground had to fight mud, sewage, storms, and poor drainage. Archaeology suggests that urban layers can accumulate through rebuilding, resurfacing, demolition debris, fires, floods, and ordinary occupation. Streets are not fixed objects. They are edited. A city keeps revising its own floor. One generation lays stones, another adds fill, another installs pipes, another raises the grade, another tears open the whole thing again because apparently the pipes were placed by someone with a poetic but unhelpful understanding of gravity. You stop beside a building whose lower windows sit almost at ankle height. Iron bars cross them. Behind the glass, the interior drops into shadow. It is easy to see why the imagination wakes up here. A careful reading might suggest that buried-looking architecture creates a powerful visual mystery because it appears to reverse common sense. Buildings should rise from the ground, not sink into it. Doors should invite people in, not open into soil. Windows should look outward, not stare into the knees of passing strangers. When viewers see these features without local history, they may wonder whether a catastrophe covered the old world and later generations simply built on top of it. That is the core of the popular mud flood idea. A fringe idea proposes that a massive, relatively recent event buried parts of cities worldwide and concealed an earlier civilization, sometimes linked online to Tartaria. This theory isn't widely accepted. The evidence we do have points instead to many local causes: floods, fires, grading projects, sanitation improvements, street raising, basement adaptations, landslides, demolition fill, and the slow accumulation of urban layers. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, the evidence for one global mud flood is thin. But the feeling that inspires the theory is not imaginary. You really can stand in front of these half-buried windows and feel that the city is hiding a lower story. Historians still argue whether some grade changes were driven more by sanitation, transportation, flood control, real estate development, or the uneven practical needs of fast-growing cities. The answer often depends on the place. One city might raise streets because standing water made daily life miserable. Another might do it to accommodate sewer lines. Another might gradually build up street levels after repeated repairs. Another might turn older first floors into basements when commercial streets changed around them. Most historians agree that urban transformation is usually local, messy and layered rather than single and dramatic. Still, the details can feel uncanny. You descend a few worn steps beside a brick wall. The air cools immediately. The smell changes from wet horse leather and street mud to damp stone, dust, old wood, and a faint mineral chill. A small arched doorway sits below the modern sidewalk. Its lintel is scarred. Its hinges are rusty. Somewhere overhead, wagon wheels rumble like distant thunder. You look up and see people passing above you, their boots moving across grates and paving stones. For a moment, the city becomes double. One city at street level, busy and loud, and another underneath, quiet and patient. One interpretation is that buried doors and lower windows became symbolic because they seemed to preserve a disagreement between past and present. The building says, "I once met the street here." The street says, "Not anymore." That disagreement is visible in brick. It gives the mind a seam to pull, and once the seam is open, the mystery grows. What if the lower levels were not basements at all? What if they were once proper streets? What if the city's true ground floor is sleeping below you? That's a possibility in some individual cases, especially where grades were raised, but it is not a universal conclusion. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Some buried-looking features might reflect old street levels, while others were always designed as cellars, storage spaces, light wells, or service areas. A more cautious explanation could be that 19th century cities were constantly adapting to uncomfortable realities. Mud was a serious problem. Drainage mattered, sewers mattered, fires destroyed districts, floods damaged foundations, streets needed levelling for carts, rails, and later streetcars. Raising a road could be cheaper than solving every underlying problem elegantly. Cities are not always built like perfect plans. Often they are built like exhausted compromises. The result is a patchwork, and later viewers mistake the patchwork for a cipher. You continue through a narrow lane where rainwater gathers in ruts. A worker in a flat cap shovels wet gravel from a cart. Another man checks a drainage channel with the expression of someone who has seen things in drains that no bedtime channel should describe in detail. We are staying PG-13, thankfully, but 19th century sanitation had a personality, and that personality was not invited to dinner. The city's grand facades depended on very unromantic underworlds: drains, privies, pipes, culverts, cellars, coal rooms, storage vaults, and foundations. This theory isn't widely accepted, but the mud flood rumour does point towards something genuinely interesting. Cities contain hidden layers. Archaeologists, preservationists, and urban historians often study those layers to understand how streets shifted and buildings changed. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm from a single photograph. A picture of a buried window does not tell you whether the street was raised in 1855, whether the building was designed with a basement, whether the sidewalk was rebuilt, whether the lot was regraded, or whether later fill changed the view. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clues keep sounding familiar. The damp brick smell returns from the earlier streets. The rail click is fainter now, buried under rain. The trowel scrape becomes the scrape of shovels. Everything points to the same pattern. Construction is not only about raising walls, it is also about raising ground, redirecting water, covering mistakes, adapting old spaces, and forcing a city to keep functioning when nature would rather turn the whole place into soup. You climb back to the modern sidewalk, and those half windows blink from below like tired eyes. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that cities often changed grade, rebuilt streets, and buried or altered earlier levels. The interpretation is that these changes can create an eerie visual record of urban adaptation. The imagined part is the quiet what if. What if every city has a lower memory, not necessarily a hidden empire, but a buried version of itself, where old doors still wait for streets that no longer come. The rain softens, the mud darkens. Somewhere below your feet, water slips through a drain, carrying dust, straw, ash, and little scraps of the day into unseen channels. You keep walking, careful on the slick stones, while the city whispers from above and below at once. You leave the rain-dark street behind, but the lower windows stay with you, blinking in memory like little basement moons. The city rises again, not all at once, not magically. It rises in parts, a cornice above a shopfront, a tower beyond a market, a dome swelling over the roofline like a sleeping planet. You turn a corner and there it is, one of those great old buildings that makes modern eyes stop and behave for once. Columns stand in front, arches repeat along the side. A clock tower lifts into the dull light. Stone steps widen toward the street, worn smooth by thousands of boots. Even the pigeons seem slightly more official here, though obviously still unemployed. Most historians agree that many 19th century public buildings borrowed heavily from older European architectural traditions. Classical Revival, Beaux-Arts, Renaissance Revival, Romanesque Revival, Gothic Revival, Second Empire and other historic styles gave new cities a sense of inherited dignity. A courthouse might borrow the language of Rome. A bank might dress itself like a temple. A library might suggest an Italian palace. A train station might combine engineering with theatrical grandeur, as though the act of buying a ticket required emotional preparation and possibly a small orchestra. The evidence we do have points to a culture that believed buildings could teach. Public architecture was not only shelter, it was messaging. Columns suggested order, domes suggested importance, towers suggested civic pride, symmetry suggested control, ornament suggested prosperity. Even if the street outside was muddy, crowded, smoky, and full of horses making poor decisions in public, the building itself could say, "This community matters. This town has a future. This government intends to look permanent, even if the roof is currently leaking into a clerk's office and everyone is pretending not to notice." You step closer to the facade and notice the details. Stone leaves curl beneath a balcony. A lion's face watches from a cornice. Iron railings twist into patterns. Windows are set deep in shadow. The door is heavy enough to make every entrance feel like a contract. A careful reading might suggest that this level of ornament is one reason people today feel suspicious. Modern construction often prizes speed, cost control, and clean surfaces. Old buildings seem to spend beauty everywhere, even in places most people barely notice. Why carve a bracket high above the street? Why decorate a drain pipe? Why give a warehouse arched windows and a roofline with personality? Honestly, the warehouse did not need to serve cheekbones, but there it is. A more cautious explanation could be that ornament was not always as expensive relative to total construction as we assume today. Skilled labour costs, material availability, building practices, and aesthetic expectations were different. Cast iron, terracotta, pressed metal, moulded plaster, patterned brick, and catalogue order details could create elaborate effects more efficiently than hand carving every surface from solid stone. Some details were mass-produced, some were assembled from repeating components, some were applied as surfaces over simpler structures. This does not make the work fake, it makes it industrial, clever, and sometimes surprisingly economical. Still, the emotional question remains. If old builders could create this beauty, why does so much modern construction feel flatter? One interpretation is that people are not only reacting to the buildings, they are reacting to a loss of visible care. Whether or not the old world was kinder, cleaner, or more graceful is another question entirely. And often the answer is no, please do not romanticize the plumbing. But old ornament gives the eye something to rest on. It suggests time, even when it was produced quickly. It creates the feeling that someone expected the building to be seen. This is where the Tartarian imagination shifts from speed to skill. A fringe idea proposes that domes, towers, and elaborate facades may reflect lost technologies or a forgotten civilization with abilities beyond ordinary 19th century craft. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it grows from a real sense of awe. Some buildings do seem almost too rich in detail for the timelines attached to them. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a question about lost knowledge in a softer sense. Not necessarily anti-gravity engines hidden in domes, but perhaps lost habits of apprenticeship, lost trades, lost materials, lost public ambition, and lost patience for ornament that does not immediately increase quarterly revenue. Tragic, really. The cornice had no business plan. Historians still argue whether the decline of ornate public architecture came mainly from changing taste, modernist ideals, labour costs, new materials, fire codes, zoning, maintenance expenses, economic pressures, or shifts in political culture. There's no full consensus because all of those forces mattered in different places and at different times. What's broadly accepted is that architecture changed dramatically in the 20th century. Steel frames, reinforced concrete, elevators, curtain walls, mechanical systems and modern planning reshaped what buildings could be and what clients expected them to do. Ornament did not vanish overnight, but its role changed. Many architects came to see historical decoration as unnecessary, dishonest, or old-fashioned. Many developers came to see it as expensive. Between ideology and budget, the gargoyles had a rough century. You pass into the shadow of the dome, the air cools, your footsteps echo across stone. High above, the curve of the ceiling gathers sound, pulling whispers upward. It is easy to understand why some people imagine domes as something more than architecture. Online theories sometimes describe them as energy devices, atmospheric collectors, or forgotten machines. A popular rumor claims that certain old towers and domes once harvested electricity from the air. This theory is not widely accepted, and the physical evidence for such claims is thin. Most domes are better explained through architecture, symbolism, acoustics, ventilation, roof structure, and visual drama. Still, if we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, the rumor reveals something interesting. People sense that these buildings once interacted with the city in ways modern structures often do not. They shaped sound, light, movement, ceremony, and civic imagination. You look up and allow the thought to remain gentle. What if each dome is not a sleeping machine, but a sleeping memory of public ambition? What if the tower is not hiding a lost technology, but preserving a lost confidence in making useful buildings beautiful? What if the strange feeling comes from seeing practical spaces treated with ceremony? That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is interpretation, but it may explain why the mystery feels so persistent. The documented world is full enough without forcing it into certainty. Architects trained in academies, pattern books circulated designs, builders reused familiar forms, craftsmen learned through apprenticeships and trade networks. Immigrant artisans brought skills from Europe and adapted them to American materials and markets. Factories produced ornament in repeatable pieces. Cities competed with one another for prestige. Newspapers praised grand openings. Politicians loved buildings that made their administrations look serious. Banks loved buildings that made their money look safe. And the public, standing beneath columns and domes, often understood the message immediately. This place wants to be remembered. You step back outside. The street is still rough. A cart rattles by. Coal smoke hangs low. Someone nearby argues about a delivery, proving that even in the shadow of architectural glory, humanity remains committed to being mildly inconvenient. The dome behind you catches a pale edge of light. It does not need to be a machine to feel alive. It only needs to gather scale, memory, craft, and silence into one shape. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that revival architecture, industrial production, skilled labour, and public ambition made ornate 19th century buildings possible. The interpretation is that modern viewers may read lost social values into lost ornament. The imagined part is softer still. What if the dome is sleeping, not with hidden power, but with the remembered breath of everyone who entered below it and looked up? You keep walking, the same small sounds follow you. Brick dust, rail clicks, shovel scrape, rainwater under the street. Now another sound joins them, the hollow echo beneath the dome, fading slowly as though the building is not finished speaking. The echo beneath the dome fades behind you, but it does not vanish. It follows you into the working side of the city, where the grand face of architecture gives way to yards, sheds, piles of stone, stacked boards, lime barrels, scaffolding, and men whose names will rarely be carved anywhere. Here, the city feels less like a mystery and more like a long, organized ache. You pass a team of bricklayers moving in rhythm, a pair of carpenters measuring beams, a mason tapping a block into place, and a boy carrying water with the solemn expression of someone who has already learned that adulthood is mostly errands with worse shoes. Most historians agree that huge teams of labourers, engineers, tradesmen, clerks, suppliers, quarry workers, foundry workers and planners made 19th century construction possible. The buildings that later look impossible were usually not the work of one genius or one lost civilization, but of many coordinated systems. The evidence we do have points to human networks as dense as the cities themselves. One person drafts a plan, another calculates loads, another orders brick, another cuts stone, another hauls sand, another mixes mortar, another cooks cheap meals for workers, another repairs a wagon, another copies receipts in a ledger by dim light, while quietly wishing numbers would stop existing. You stand near a construction site where the air is full of layered sounds. Trowels scrape, saws rasp, hammers knock, horses snort, chains clink. Someone coughs in the dust. Someone laughs at a joke that is probably not worth preserving for the historical record. The smell is sharp and heavy: lime, sweat, wet wood, horse manure, coal smoke, clay and wool. This is the part old photographs usually hide. A finished building is quiet. A building under construction is an argument between materials, weather, money, and time. One interpretation is that the anonymity of labour feeds the Tartarian mystery more than almost anything else. When you do not see the workers, the work seems ownerless. When the owner is clear, but the labour is invisible, the mind looks for another explanation. A courthouse appears, a train station appears, a hotel appears, a fair palace appears. But the names of the people who lifted, cut, fired, mixed, hauled, carved, hammered, plastered and cleaned often disappear into the dust. Later, someone sees the finished structure and asks, "Who built this?" The official answer might name an architect or a company, but the deeper answer is a crowd. A careful reading might suggest that lost builders are sometimes not mythical at all. They are ordinary workers erased by class, language, migration, poverty and poor record keeping. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, China and many other communities helped build cities, railroads, tunnels, bridges, factories, neighbourhoods and public works. Enslaved labour and forced or exploited labour also shaped earlier infrastructure in some regions, and later wage labour often remained dangerous and unfair. We should be gentle but not vague. Grandeur often rested on exhaustion. Beautiful buildings can have uncomfortable foundations, not just in stone, but in human cost. Historians still argue whether the rapid expansion of 19th century cities should be celebrated mainly as industrial achievement or studied mainly as a story of labour exploitation, risk, and uneven reward. There's no full consensus because both truths can stand in the same muddy street. The city was impressive. The city was harsh, the buildings were ambitious, the wages were often low, the craft was real, the injuries were real, the civic pride was real. The tired backs were also very real, and unlike marble statues, tired backs do not usually get plaques. You watch a mason at work. His movements are small, practiced, almost quiet. He spreads mortar, sets a brick, taps it level, scrapes away the excess, then reaches for the next. There is no drama in one brick. But the rhythm accumulates. One brick becomes a course. One course becomes a wall. One wall becomes a room. One room becomes a building. One building becomes a block. One block becomes the part of a city that later makes someone whisper, "Impossible." The word impossible often arrives when the middle steps are missing. That is why the fringe theory has emotional force. A fringe idea proposes that unknown builders from a forgotten Tartarian civilization left behind much of the architecture later claimed by modern nations. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals a hunger to restore agency to someone. People sense that the official stories can feel too neat. Architect, date, opening ceremony, done. But real construction stories are crowded. Many hands vanish. Many documents vanish. Many workers pass through a project and leave no signature except alignment, pressure, polish and wear. A more cautious explanation could be that the so-called missing civilization is actually missing labour history. Not one hidden empire, but thousands of hidden lives. The man who cut the stone, the woman who washed his clothes, the child who carried lunch, the teamster who hauled timber through mud, the quarry crew who worked in cold light, the plasterer who shaped an ornament high above eye level, knowing almost nobody would notice and doing it well anyway. What if the mystery is pointing at something else? What if the true disappearance is not a continent but credit? You move through a quarry in your imagination now because the city pulls its bones from elsewhere. Stone faces are cut from the earth. Dust hangs in the air. Tools ring against rock. Blocks are levered, dragged, loaded and shipped. It is slow, dangerous work, and not at all improved by the absence of modern ergonomic training videos. Somewhere in a foundry, iron glows orange. Somewhere in a forest, timber falls. Somewhere in a brickyard, clay is pressed and fired. The building site is only the final gathering place. The construction begins long before the first wall rises. What's broadly accepted is that industrial coordination made scale possible. Standardized parts, trade specialization, rail transport, urban demand and financial speculation all work together. Banks financed buildings, cities issued bonds, contractors managed crews, insurance companies shaped fireproofing concerns, building codes developed unevenly, newspapers announced projects, architects adapted styles, material suppliers competed for contracts. The result could be rapid growth, but not effortless growth. It took planning, risk, and an enormous tolerance for mud. Still, the myth remains. A popular rumour claims that because many old buildings appear without clear construction photos, they must have been inherited. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Many projects were not photographed at every stage. Photography was expensive, cumbersome, or simply not considered necessary. Records might sit in archives, remain undigitized, or have been lost to fire, water, neglect, or the quiet tragedy of someone deciding old paperwork was clutter. To be clear, missing evidence is not automatically evidence of concealment, but missing evidence does create silence, and silence invites stories. You step back beside the construction site as evening settles. A worker rinses his hands in a bucket. Another sits on a beam and rubs his shoulder. The scaffolding creaks. A lantern is lit. The smell of fresh mortar cools in the air. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that grand cities were built by vast human systems. The interpretation is that forgotten labour makes later construction feel mysterious. The imagined part is tender. What if every unnamed worker left a small breath inside the walls and the buildings still hold it, not as magic, but as memory? The city grows quieter, though not silent. Hammers stop one by one. Horses are led away. A final trowel is cleaned against a board. And in that fading sound, you understand something simple and strange. The impossible scale may not require invisible masters. It may require visible workers, whom history trained you not to see. The last trowel scrape fades, and the city seems to hold its breath. You drift from the construction yard into a street preserved not by memory alone, but by the strange silver patience of old photography. The avenue lies ahead in a stillness that feels almost staged. Tall facades stand on both sides, their windows dark, their cornices sharp against a pale sky. A few wagons wait near the curb. A figure, blurred at the edges, seems to have moved while the camera was trying to hold the world still. The street looks empty, too empty, as if everyone stepped indoors at the same moment because history asked for privacy. Most historians agree that early photography shaped how we imagine the 19th century. Cameras recorded buildings, streets, bridges, factories, fairs, monuments and people, but they did not capture reality in the effortless way a phone does now. Exposure times, equipment limits, chemicals, weather, lens quality, photographer choices, and staging all affected the final image. A busy street could appear quiet if moving people blurred away or failed to register clearly. A building could look older, cleaner, larger, or stranger, depending on angle, contrast, light, and what the photographer chose to include. In other words, Old photographs are evidence, but they are not neutral little windows. They are more like sleepy witnesses with excellent posture and questionable peripheral vision. You stand beside a tripod camera while a photographer adjusts the plate. He works slowly. The equipment is heavy, the process is fussy. Nobody is casually snapping 300 pictures of lunch and then deleting none of them, which may be one of the few ways the 19th century was spiritually healthier than us. The photographer selects his view carefully because each image costs time, material, and effort. He may prefer a grand building with fewer distractions. He may wait until the street is quieter. He may ask people to stand still. He may frame out clutter, scaffolding, animals, laundry, trash, or anything that makes the city look less dignified. The evidence we do have points to photography as both documentation and presentation. City views often serve civic pride, commercial promotion, architectural records, postcards, albums, or newspaper illustration. Photographers captured new courthouses, exposition palaces, opera houses, hotels, train stations, and public squares because those were the things cities wanted remembered. The result is a visual archive tilted toward grandeur. Ordinary alleys, crowded tenements, half-built sheds, muddy service yards, and exhausted workers appear less often, not because they did not exist, but because nobody was always trying to sell the romance of a drainage ditch. Though again, after several sections of mud, we both know the drainage ditch had range. One interpretation is that old photography compresses reality into mystery. When you look at a silent street lined with elaborate buildings, without movement, sound, smell, or context, it can feel abandoned. You do not hear horses snorting just outside the frame. You do not smell coal smoke. You do not see workers around the corner, children running in an alley, women carrying parcels, vendors shouting, or clerks leaning over ledgers inside. The photograph has cut a thin slice from the day and asked it to represent the whole city. That slice might be honest, but it is incomplete. Historians still argue whether early urban photographs should be read mainly as documentary evidence, promotional imagery, artistic composition, or selective civic storytelling. There's no full consensus because they can be all of these at once. A photograph of a courthouse might show a real building in a real place, while also hiding the mess around it, flattering the town, and following the aesthetic habits of the photographer. A view of an exposition might document temporary architecture while also turning it into dreamlike theatre. A street scene might look empty because the exposure, timing, or location made it so, not because the city had been mysteriously cleared. And yet you understand the rumour. A popular rumour claims that empty 19th century streets in old photographs hint at a population reset, a vanished civilization, or buildings inherited after some unknown event. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the documented explanations are often much simpler. Exposure times could blur moving figures. Photographers favoured quiet moments. Commercial images often avoided crowded disorder. Some cities really did have wide new streets before dense crowds filled them. Some photos were taken early in the morning, on quiet days, or in newly built districts waiting for businesses and residents. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Empty-looking photographs raise questions about context, but they do not by themselves support the most dramatic conclusions. You move deeper into the image, as if the old photograph has become a place. The silence is thick. Your steps make no sound. The buildings rise around you in grayscale, each brick rendered as a soft grain. A hanging sign is readable only in part. Curtains are drawn in an upstairs window. A horse stands frozen near a cart, its head slightly lowered, as though even the animal has accepted the strange dignity of being historical. Somewhere out of frame, perhaps, a street is busy, but here, in this captured avenue, time has paused between breaths. A careful reading might suggest that these photographs feel haunted because they separate architecture from daily life. Buildings without people become questions. Streets without movement become stages. Windows without faces become eyes. The Tartarian imagination enters through that stillness. What if these buildings were waiting for occupants, What if the city had been found rather than built? What if the camera caught not a quiet morning, but a world after disappearance? That is cinematic imagination, not solid conclusion. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The key is not to confuse the mood with the evidence. A more cautious explanation could be that old images lack the sensory density that would make them ordinary. Add the sounds back, and the mystery shifts. Add wagon wheels, coughing horses, iron-rimmed carts, street vendors, church bells, factory whistles, boot heels, hammer blows, and the clatter of dishes from a boarding house kitchen. Add smells too: soot, bread, damp wool, manure, river mud, cheap tobacco, hot metal, and the sour bite of uncollected refuse. Suddenly, the empty street becomes less like evidence of disappearance and more like a moment of stillness in a noisy day. Even a crowded city has quiet pockets. Even a busy life has pauses, usually when everyone is pretending not to hear the alarm clock. Still, the photographs keep their power. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm from the frame alone. You cannot always tell what time of day it is, who stood just beyond the edge, whether the street was staged, whether movement vanished in blur, whether the building had recently opened, or whether the photographer wanted stillness because stillness looked respectable. Old photographs require humility. They can support questions, they can challenge assumptions, but they rarely surrender everything at once. You stop before a photograph of a grand avenue after rain. The pavement shines. Buildings reflect in shallow puddles. A tower rises in the distance. The image feels lonely but not dead. It feels like a room where someone has just stepped out. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the what-if becomes softer and more useful. What if these empty streets are not signs of erased people, but signs of erased context? What if what vanished is not the population, but the noise around the photograph? We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is photographic technique, selective framing, civic pride, and ordinary quiet moments. The mist is the emotional strangeness of seeing great buildings without their builders, streets without crowds, and cities without sound. You let both remain. You do not force the mist into a hidden truth. You let it curl around the street lamps, settle under the cornices, and fade slowly into the same old motifs: brick dust, rail clicks, shovel scrape, rainwater, dome echo, and now the soft click of a camera shutter trying to hold a city still. The camera shutter softens into silence, and the city begins to feel less like a puzzle to solve and more like a place asking to be listened to. You stand at the edge of a wide avenue where the buildings lean upward into evening, their towers dark against a violet sky, their windows catching the last amber light. Brick, stone, iron, plaster, timber, rail, mud, smoke, and labour all seem to gather here. Every section of the city has left something behind: the trowel scrape, the rail click, the wet smell of raised streets, the hollow echo beneath a dome, the tired breath of workers, the stillness of photographs. Nothing stands alone. The scale whispers because every piece belongs to a larger rhythm. Most historians agree that industrial growth made astonishing construction possible in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Railroads moved materials, factories produced parts, skilled trades shaped details, cities competed for prestige, investors chased profit, public officials wanted monuments, workers supplied the difficult, often invisible strength. Archaeology suggests that urban layers build up slowly through repairs, fires, floods, grading, demolition, rebuilding, and daily use. The evidence we do have points to a world that was not magical, but it was intensely coordinated. And honestly, coordination may be the least romantic miracle, which is unfair because anyone who has ever organized dinner for 6 people knows civilization is already hanging by a thread. You walk past a courthouse whose steps have worn shallow in the center. That wear matters. It reminds you that buildings are not only designed, they are used. Every polished threshold is a record of feet. Every repaired wall is a record of weather. Every changed window is a record of need. A careful reading might suggest that old buildings shock us because they combine grandeur with survival. They do not merely look impressive in one photograph, they endure across decades of soot, storms, neglect, renovation, fashion, politics, and the occasional deeply questionable remodeling decision. Somewhere, someone once looked at a carved interior and thought, what this needs is fluorescent lighting. Humanity remains brave in all the wrong ways. Historians still argue whether progress alone explains the emotional shock of these buildings. That exact question sits at the center of the night. The mainstream explanation can account for much of the speed and scale: industrial supply chains, cheaper labor by modern standards, different building priorities, public ambition, historical revival styles, mass-produced ornament, and uneven record-keeping. But the feeling remains. The feeling says that something about these streets does not fit comfortably into modern expectations. Maybe that is not evidence of a hidden empire. Maybe it is evidence that our expectations have shrunk. A fringe idea proposes that Tartarian construction points to a lost global civilization, one whose buildings were inherited, altered, or hidden in plain sight. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it continues to spread because it touches a real ache. People look at old stations, libraries, domes, exhibition halls, and government buildings and wonder why public beauty once seemed so ordinary. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less about certainty and more about longing. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if people are not only asking who built these places, but why we stop building so many places that make ordinary people look up? A more cautious explanation could be that the old world feels impossible because modern life hides its own complexity. Today, buildings may rely on vast global supply chains, advanced engineering, mechanical systems, digital modeling, safety codes, and materials that earlier builders could barely imagine. Yet much of that complexity is invisible. A flat glass wall may contain extraordinary design, but it does not always tell the eye a story. An old cornice, even if mass-produced, speaks openly. It gives your attention a handhold. It says, somebody cared how the shadow would fall here. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot recover every worker's name. We cannot stand beside every architect at every drafting table. We cannot hear every argument over budgets, every delay caused by weather, every quiet pride at a grand opening, every sigh of someone sweeping plaster dust at midnight. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is industry, labour, style, records, materials, and urban growth. The mist is the feeling that stone, once arranged with enough ambition, begins to dream. You walk one last time beneath the tall facades. The city is calmer now. No crowd presses around you. No machine demands your attention. The street lamps glow softly. The smell of rain is fading from the pavement. Somewhere far away, a train gives a low, tired call, and the sound rolls through the avenue like a memory of iron. The impossible speed and scale no longer need to be forced into one answer. They can remain a layered question. Most historians agree that human systems built these cities, but one interpretation is that the buildings preserve more than contracts and dates. They preserve a kind of confidence, a willingness to make public life feel ceremonial, even when the streets were muddy and the plumbing was doing its best, which, let us be honest, was not always enough. Now the pace slows. You do not need to solve the city tonight. You simply let it settle around you. The towers stop looking like accusations and begin to look like silhouettes. The domes are no longer sleeping machines, only quiet curves holding the last warmth of the day. The buried windows are no longer proof of catastrophe, only small reminders that streets rise, cities change, and memory sometimes lives below the surface. You breathe in slowly. Coal smoke becomes evening haze. Brick dust becomes soft earth. The rail click becomes a distant lullaby. Every worker whose name disappeared can rest for a moment in the walls they helped raise. Every photograph can keep its silence without demanding a dramatic answer. Every rumour can float gently away from certainty and become only a candle in the fog. And you, standing in this calm, imagined avenue, can let the mystery remain kind. Not frightening, not urgent, just open. A puzzle made of stone, steam, labour, light and time. The city does not need to confess everything. It only needs to keep whispering as the sky darkens, as the lamps blur, as your thoughts grow slower, softer, heavier. The last thing you notice is a single window high above the street, glowing warm gold against the blue. Then even that light softens. The avenue grows quiet. The stones cool. The old city folds itself into shadow, and the night carries you gently away.